Okie dokie. All right, let's get started. So hi everybody, and thanks for joining this Craft IO webinar. Today we have a special guest, which I'm very, very excited about, drinking his coffee in the morning. Arif Gursel. Arif is a prominent leader in the product space. I've been working in small companies like Microsoft and Salesforce and Zillow, and then now he's a founder of a company called ViBEHEAVY, and also runs an accelerator of sorts-ish, kind of. I probably distorted it completely, but kind of. So I'm very, very happy to have him today. And today we're going to talk about something that probably bothers most people in the world, and specifically most people in the product space, which is how to run an effective product team when you work remotely. This is something that I think is, it's becoming, as time progresses, it's becoming more and more of a challenge, but also I think an interesting opportunity for people to master this. And Arif has kindly agreed to come and share with us his thoughts. This is going to be a very informal kind of webinar, much more of a kind of like fireside chat conversation. Feel free to use both the chat and the Q&A. I've opened the Q&A, so if people have questions, just ideally just log them here, so that when we get to the Q&A section, we can just have a long list and we can just go through them. So feel free to just log any burning questions you have there. But if you let's just also make it interactive. So if you guys feel a burning topic, you can feel free to chat. And also, I would say, maybe say hi right now to everybody on the chat, just so that people feel like it's a little bit more of a conversation rather than we're talking and you're just all listening. So you can use the chat on Zoom just to say hi or high five, or use your favorite emoji. Oh, there we go. Hey, from Canada. We have a lot of people joining. Great. I'm glad to see people from lots of places in the world. So feel free to add your highs and welcomes. All right, so Arif, first of all, I think you're on mute, so unmute yourself, most importantly.
Bang, I thought you muted me. I'm like, Elad doesn't want me to speak yet, so I'm going to be quiet.
No, on the contrary. No, yeah, you're the star.
Good morning, everyone.
Well, I think we have morning,
night,
afternoon, evening.
Themes,
we have the whole thing. We have the whole thing. So yeah. Welcome everybody, and welcome Arif. So I think if it's okay, if we can start, I mean, the first topic that I wanted to talk to you about is about communication. And this has been a very, I mean, you see the skyrocketing of Zoom, and, and people talk about, when people think about communication, I think nowadays people think about Zoom and Slack, right? So I think that's the two things that come to mind. I'd love to get your sense of what does effective communication means in your mind in this era. I think you've been running teams remotely for many, many years, but I mean, regardless, it's good to get a sense from you, especially nowadays, rather than just general remote work.
Yeah.
What is it that you think would be, people need to think about when they're talking about effective communication?
Well, I think ultimately, whether we're talking about communication culture, operations, ultimately, I think it all comes down to an established set of processes within a team, right? And an understanding of what communication means within your organization, within your team, right? And so one of the first things I try to do is determine what is real-time communication, right? What does that mean to us? What platforms we actually use for real-time communication? And ultimately it breaks down, I think, into asynchronous or synchronous communication, right? There's communication where we need to be synchronous in nature, right? Where we're working on a problem, we're real time going back and forth, and it makes more sense to maybe hop on a video call, or jump in a virtual room, or if we're in a hybrid scenario, punt that meeting until we can all be together if we know we're going to be together in a week or so, versus asynchronous communication that you don't necessarily need me in real time, right, to make a decision. And I think the more you start to work in remote and distributed teams, the more you need to figure out how to be efficient asynchronously, because ultimately you're trying to let people do their best work wherever they are, and that may never time zone match, right?
Yeah,
and so for me, I'm a very I'm a very weird person. I keep weird hours. I think because I've worked in distributed environments for so long that like, I don't really have a sense of a time zone. So it's funny that I say good morning because I've actually been up since 2 a.m. right?
Yeah.
But, you know, in that, you're just trying to figure out, like, I do a lot of my communication thought processing between the hours of like 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. PST, right? And so one of the things I say to people on my team is, just because you see communication from me does not mean you need to respond to that, right? Like, I don't have an expectation that that's real time, that I'm sending it at 3 a.m. my time, and you're gonna get up and respond to me, right? Yeah. And so setting that culture around what communication means, I think is more important than the type of communication. Because the truth is, every organization I've been in has just a different comm style, right? And that's one of the things I usually ask leadership when I come in, like, what is the comm style for this organization? How do you communicate? How do you like to be communicated with? How do you like information shared?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for that. That's great. And I really like the differentiation between synchronous and asynchronous, because I think that's really critical. And I think a lot of people miss out on that, you know, separation between what is like instant messaging or like a video call versus what fits like a document or a prompt, like something that is sitting there and is not like waiting for your response, like immediate response. So I mean that I would say also, and if I may just like throw my 2 cents into this a little bit, within the synchronous world for a second, in my mind, there's a very clear hierarchy that now broke a little bit. So I always used to tell my teams that I was running, say, start with face-to-face. The top place to go to is a face-to-face environment. And if you can't do that, then you do a video or a call, and then you do messaging. And the reason I say that, and this is something that of course is personal also, but I would love to hear your thoughts about that. You want to be in a, like when you talk synchronously, you want to be in a mode that allows for the least amount of errors, both from content perspective, but also from an intent perspective. What I mean by that, like sometimes you write things in Slack and people could be like, what? Like people could be outraged, like you woke up and it's like 3 in the morning and you just wrote something. You're not even like, you know, you're not completely thinking about the whole thing. And then there's a person on the other side who could be like, oh, like, I can't believe you wrote that, right? So, and I think this is one of the things, like, as we lost face-to-face in many aspects right now, like face-to-face as in like physical face-to-face. Mm-hmm. For me, like within the world of synchronous, like the ability to hear the person and the tone and the ability to correct course in the conversation is critical.
It's super important. And you know, I think one of the things, as your team becomes more distributed, and I believe like we are just in a time where we're examining what that actually means. Like I believe most teams are distributed, right? Like the larger a company becomes, the more separated the individuals in the company become, whether that's different floors, different office buildings, right? Like we start working in some form of distribution. And as that happens, I think it puts onus on written communication. It just becomes so much more important. Like, how do you verbalize your thoughts? How do you get those across in a clean enough manner that people of diverse backgrounds and communication styles can understand? Becomes super important. I think it also forces you to look at personality traits a little bit more, right? So if you were an individual who relied heavily on slang or like in-person communication or, you know, sarcasm, right? That does not translate well to a distributed team when someone is of a foreign culture, maybe English as a second language in a totally different place, and doesn't get that thing you said was like a joke. Right? And so perfect. Like, and so if anything, like I've gotten to a place where it feels less personable. I almost feel like you can't bring what would be your authentic self. As people trying to describe that, like, what does that mean when you bring your whole self? Well, sometimes you got to kind of keep some of that whole self away in distributed work because you aren't there to give the whole like 360 context of who you are. And so it's better to like err on the side of caution and just say like, I will be clear, try not to be verbose, you know, and then in that case, you know, get people on the same page. But when it comes to the hierarchy of communication, I would say that may be what works for you.
Yeah.
In that scenario. And I'm also like, as a product person, I create a lot of process because I believe personally, like, I don't look at process as a bad word, right? Like, it's funny. I've been in organizations where people are like, oh my God, the product team, they create so much process. Like, to me, that just indicates that they have a lot of bad process, right? Because like, also not having a process is process.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
It's just a random process.
it's just random, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
you can either pay attention to it and fix it, or like be, you know, be focused about what you do. And so in that, I talked on the product teams that I build of like, when we do retros, when we do look backs, I also want to look at our process as the product. We should be iterating on what worked, what didn't work. And if in there, one of the things we might just focus on is our communication style as a team this quarter didn't work, because you know what, Elad, we were trying to get a hold of you and like we were pinging you in Slack and you weren't in Slack and you were saying text you. Well, we're not going to argue about that. What we have is a communication process misalignment of my team. And I want to figure out how to like just fix that so everyone is effective as a team. And the truth is, like, I've worked with teams of all sizes, like you said, small startups, large companies, distributed, hybrid, 100%. The truth is, no place is identical. And every place I go in, I have to evaluate the skill set and the styles of both the leadership and the team under me and kind of be that glue. And that's what I think product managers are. I think we are we manage the white space. We are the glue of everyone else's really defined roles of execution. And we got to kind of like, we're the jugglers, right? We have to come in and understand business priorities, technical priorities, legal priorities, and make sure that all those things, we're the human API for all of those things, right? Communication and execution.
Okay, that's great. So if I had to synthesize it just for the kind of like the people on the call. So first of all, differentiate between what fits synchronous and asynchronous, because these are two very distinct ways of communication. And like one, then two, if you're debating whether to bring your full personality into a communication on a distributed team, err on caution rather than on being like full-fledged, just because people can misinterpret you, misunderstand the context that you're in. I think that's, and then the third piece, if I kind of synthesize, is about basically having the ability to tailor the communication style to the specific team that you're in. And it's like, while it might be a little bit of an obvious thing to say, like it's like, it is different in each team, right? So if a team has been running together for like a year now, and now they're just like forced to be distributed, maybe that's a different type of communication versus if it's the team of new team members and everybody's like in different geographies, etc. Right? So it kind of changes. Cool. That's super helpful. And I remind everybody on the call, if you want to ask any questions, feel free to just chat or just like put it in the Q&A section. So the second topic I want to chat to you about is about tools. So you started touching upon this a little bit, but I'd love to get a bit of a sense of like a rundown of what you feel are, in both cases, like both synchronous and asynchronous, like things that you feel are helpful for your team to improve communication. And things, maybe even things that you might find damaging. I have one example of like a communication damaging tool, which I'll mention afterwards. But I'm gonna let you start, of course. So what
I'm like, well, can we start with the damage? I want to start.
No. That's I leave it at the end. It's a very commonly used tool, by the way. But anyway, let's go.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump out there with the commonly used tool that I have a love-hate relationship with.
Sure.
Slack. Slack is the tool that I love and I hate at the same part of the day.
Yeah.
I don't want to be, and so it took me a long time to figure out like what was my problem with Slack. And it's not Slack. Slack is not my problem. It's just a communication platform like everything that has allowed us to communicate in the past. The problem that I have with Slack is that there's no uniformity of understanding of how to use it. It's kind of become like the Jira for communication. Everybody kind of uses it differently.
Yeah.
And so the more teams that use it, the more channels that I get into, it becomes a free-for-all. And sometimes there's more noise in it than I would actually like there to be. And so I wind up removing myself from channels. And what happens is I rely on people to tag me in things that are critical for me to see. And I look for that behavior versus just watching a channel, because again, Slack has become that thing for me that is not synchronous communication. I have actually put that into asynchronous communication bucket, non-critical.
I'm sure the leadership of Slack won't be happy to hear that, but I completely understand where you're coming from. By the way, Slack, I mean, we're not, both of us use Slack, and a lot.
Right.
I'm sure without checking, many people on the call are using Slack, and I think Teams is the same in just, you know, kind of like a.
Yeah, there's nothing better, right? Like, I'm not saying, like, I'm not, you know, for me, it just became like, as we started talking about, it's not about the tool. Again, it's about the process, and it's about what the team has the understanding. And I remember in a previous startup, I was working with some people, and we decided to like cancel a meeting. I didn't decide to cancel a meeting. I was there, and I was waiting for my team. And the whole time they said, well, we Slacked you. And I said, guys, I don't check Slack like a real-time communication platform if I'm outside of a place waiting for you. Like, that's when I expect a text message or a phone call. So we had to go through this whole exercise of like, what type of communication do we expect in what scenario? And so Slack in my place has become more of like a thought repository. It has become more of a place to pin interesting things when I work in partnership organizations. So for instance, you know, in my previous role at Salesforce, I was managing partnerships and product. I would get a lot of inbound questions from support teams that were like, hey, how do I find this information about this partner? So as you know, people are asking me these reoccurring questions. It's easy for me to pin that into a channel. You can self-serve. So again, I'm using this tool not just for communication. It has a lot of other features in it. And as I think about my product process, it doesn't become the free-for-all place for you to just throw a thing at me and expect a real-time communication. But you also have to kind of establish that process and be transparent with people and like proliferate that through your organization, because people also have an expectation of these tools that might not align with your usage, right? And so you have to marry those two things. But
so that's Slack. So that's Slack.
Slack. You know, I think it's obvious. We can talk about how we met, right? Like, craft has been a part of my life for a long time. And that's not because you and I are talking about this. I mean, I think how we met is you guys looked up in the database and one day it was like, hey, you've been a user for a long time. Can we talk to you about the product? And how I got to it was literally managing a distributed siloed team. I had come into a company where I was the first product leader, and essentially we were 100+ engineering leadership and never had product management before. And they had gotten themselves into like siloed engineering teams. Everyone was using Jira differently. And at that time, you know, I was tasked with coming in and like kind of providing this strategic layer and this like roadmap layer that could like move all of this forward. And so I was looking for a tool that could like overlay on top of Jira that I could connect everyone to and kind of write things at a strategic layer without disrupting. So that's how I ultimately got to Craft and our relationship. So Craft is actually key in my workflow. And, you know, there are other things that you can use on the market. I love the software and I love the integrations, but ultimately what it allows me to do is it allows me to keep my strategic insights in one place while also kind of having an understanding, and I can keep that tightly bound with like the engineering roadmap all the way down to a story level if I want to. And then I can figure out, like, again, as I talk about being that glue as a product manager, right? Like, I can bring different parts of an organization in and share kind of a central road mapping. And the reason that's important for me, because I've watched people do this in various organizations, whether it's Trello, whether it's Jira, whether, you know, whatever the tool is, ultimately there's this world where people are trying to manage the task of being a project manager, right? Like the stories, things I have to execute with engineering and designers. Then they're also trying to manage like the strategic direction. And then you're also trying to kind of bring those two worlds together to manage like the roadmap, you know, where those go and how that impacts the business. And so you're ultimately using a variety of set of tools depending on where you go. And so ultimately the thing that's most important to me is how can I integrate into wherever, you know, I use. So like, that's why the, you know, like the Zapier integration is super important. So if, you know, if I know I have that and I have Craft, I can, you know, craft the workflow that I need depending on the organization and the processes that I'm trying to set in place.
All right. So that's so that we don't be completely blamed for like, in product promotion for the whole webinar. I'll mention two things. One, there are other tools in the market and they're good and they all have their different flavors. So, I mean, but I do think, and kind of just to jump in, of course, I mean, the notion of having a product layer is this layer between the very tactical and the super strategic, right? So between the Jira ticket and the presentation. And I think especially nowadays, people look for that layer to understand what's going on without being too high level, as in, okay, that's just like bullet points on a presentation, or on the flip side, like going into a Jira and then like just getting lost in the whole myriad of like everything that's going on right now to the task and subtask level. I think that's, from my perspective, from a tools perspective, I mean, for obvious reasons, I think that's an important part of every company's. So let's talk more about other tools that you're kind of using for your day-to-day. Beyond those tools.
Managing non-engineering teams, as I work with marketing and others, especially as you start to think about more like content development in the marketing space, go-to-market campaigns, things of that nature, what it blogs. I've been trying to use Trello more and more and integrate with Trello. And I'm trying to figure out this balance of working with my marketing leadership directly in craft versus like, how do I start to like tie or integrate maybe back into Trello, which feels more like a natural tool for me to be using with them. And the reason why is I believe in process-driven businesses, right? Like set up checklists, set up things where people, they have to go through process, right? Like I want you to think about the things where like innovation really needs your horsepower, right? And not the things like don't cut corners on the small things, right? Like I like repeatable business and repeatable process. So creating templates and lanes in Trello and cards and working on the strategy of what that is, and then converting that into boards where people can just kind of execute against those lanes. Doing a lot of that. Ultimately moving everything cloud, when it comes to on the product side, Figma for design, working with my designers. I was a huge Adobe fan. I still personally love Adobe XD, but it's just easier to work with Figma across platform, across other things. I used to do a lot of balsamic wireframing and things like that. So classic tool set on the design side. I'm an Adobe guy. I am trying to figure out how to do more in one place. It's just harder. I mean, really, it depends on the size of the organization, right? I think a lot of times. Yeah, go ahead. When I go into large orgs, sometimes it's dictated by IT. So I've had times where there are tools I want to use, and I got to go fight the IT gods. They're like, hey, I want you to open up this thing and create this connectivity for me. And they're like, I don't want to do that. No, right? No. So I got to use whatever the company uses.
I am going to ask, so the damaging one I wanted to talk about, and it's interesting because, I mean, it's also related to Slack in a way, and I think to what Slack is slowly becoming in a way, is email. So in my mind, email is one of the, I mean, I'm not a big fan of email. I mean, I use it, of course. It's a very classic way of communication. It's asynchronous by its nature, but in my mind, email has always been stuck in this hybrid between asynchronous yet synchronous. Like there's a little bit of an expectation and a little bit of that. Like it's not exactly like neither in this camp nor in that camp. Like people can write like these long, super long emails. And I've developed my own set of rules for like, when should an email thread stop and become a conversation? Like if you have a thread of longer than 4, then it has to become a conversation, because otherwise, and also I've taught my team to avoid thinking that if you threw something in an email and just send it to everybody, now everybody is aware. To your point about Slack, and that was kind of like my connection. It's not responsible to just assume that because if I put it in this channel, then everybody is aware. I mean, we can all sit and pretend that everybody's aware, but it doesn't help actual communication. It just helps you feel okay that you communicated, right? So, and this is one of the things that I feel is like very hard.
Yeah, and I think when you move to remote teams, I think that's an assumption you have to remove, right? Like I never make an assumption that people have read an email or the document. And I think you have to create process that ensures you bring your team along with you.
Yeah.
And so like, for instance, you mentioned the incubator and the nonprofit that we run right now. Like
just called an accelerator, but
Yeah, right. I mean, but Yeah, this little small thing that we're doing in Seattle. But
Yeah.
you know, we have a chief marketing officer, for instance, right? And Bree, who you were speaking to, her and I have a dedicated meeting on Mondays, right? Like that's our sprint planning for the week. And there's an hour and a half in the day and an hour and a half in the evening. And the first part of the day is like, let's review last week and let's go through everything. Let's think through strategically. And then I let her go for the day. And like, we do some planning in the morning. It's like, I want you to think about these problems we've discussed. And then we'll come together at the end of the day to organize the sprint and prioritize things. And then after that, we have 2 meetings throughout the week that she owns. She can move them wherever she needs to, but they have to happen sometime on Wednesday or sometime on Friday, right? Like move it how you want, find the schedule. If you can't make it happen on Wednesday and Friday, then you've just shifted your workday to Thursday and Saturday, right? Like that's just our process understanding, because I need that checkpoint with you to make sure that I'm moving you along information. Because in between that time, I tell her, I might send you an email. I might shoot you a text message. I want you to actually ignore it. That's me adding things to your backlog, not actually trying to disrupt your sprint right now.
Yeah.
And so when we touch base midweek and end of the week, that's when we'll look and say, do I need to do a priority shift? Or how important is that thing I sent you? Or, hey, let's talk through that email that I sent you. Because I basically send that email as like, I expect it to be like a record, almost for you to archive it.
Yeah.
But at some point in time, I'm gonna create process that forces us to talk about it before we have to actually go act upon it.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, I love that concept of a backlog. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges people face. Especially with synchronous communication. Synchronous communication is confusing for humans because it immediately takes over attention regardless of priority. Immediately. Like you get a Slack message coming from here or from there. And you're like, okay, this, like, because of our, limited brains, all of us, you're now feeling like I have to attend to this. And that's just wrong. It's a backlog item in many cases that has to be written somewhere and minuted as a backlog item to handle later. And that's
I found that human beings actually need permission to break that mental model, right? Like you have to tell people like, you're going to see this and I actually don't want you to respond to it.
That's
right. Like I am just adding to your backlog. And so just ignore it. But I've created meetings for us to talk about those things, because we also, as human beings, we can't quite forget that thing our boss sent us. Right. Even if they say it's not important, right? It's like, oh, it's not important. Like I sent you this thing, but don't worry about it. It's like, we need some time to actually have that conversation.
Of course. So that's great. And that's a great tip in terms of process, that's having this touch points where you can kind of like review the backlog rather than just like, otherwise people go a little bit nuts and just like continuously just look at everything all the time kind of thing. We have a question from one of the people on the webinar, which is really good, actually. I'll read it out loud for everybody to kind of. So how do you convince a company of 250 employees to move towards an asynchronous communication culture instead of an always on Slack culture? Like this, the lady saying, I worked remotely as a PM for a while, recently joined an office first company, and everybody moved remotely. And she was very used to being async, and now everybody is like very synchronous. So how would you tackle that? How would you kind of like start shifting shifting the culture or influencing the culture in that direction, so that asynchronous and synchronous are a bit more balanced?
So let me understand. She was once a remote employee and now she's working in office again at a hybrid place, or is it all? Yeah,
she worked in a remote environment. Then she moved to a different company that is normally in office. Now everybody is remote.
But
they're very used to being like very Slack synchronous culture oriented. And how do you shift to asynchronous in this?
I don't know. I'll be honest. Like I'm excited about what's happening right now outside of like the loss of human life, right? Like that's the sad part. But you and I, we've had this conversation in the past. Like I have personally been a fan of the future of work since 2010, right? When I first said I was working at Microsoft and I realized like I literally only went into the office to like get my like card key changed or pick up something. There was no reason for me to go to Microsoft to do my job, right? Like I had internet connectivity, a laptop, and I was in the world. And I started having these things like, why do I need to go to an office? I think the problem is you have you have three types of companies out here, right? You have those who have embraced the future of work, right? So they're fully distributed, right? And you have like Buffer and like, other companies that are just leading the space in this. Yeah. Then you have hybrid companies who are like, they have some people distributed, but they still maintain some kind of like co-location headquarter, right? And then you have companies who just don't believe in it. And so what COVID has done is it has forced everyone into the future of work, which I'm excited about, because the thing that this economy has missed is executive leaders paying true attention to what their teams need to be successful distributed. Now we're being forced to be in an environment where these executives who once forced everyone into an office building, they have to think about what success looks like for themselves, for their companies, for their teams. They're gonna have to create culture and process around this. So I think it's an opportunity, honestly, for people who have come from remote lifestyle, who are actually going into companies who are being forced to move into this space. It's actually time for you to take a leadership position in your company and helping them understand this. I think there's a balance in how you do that. So the first thing I would do is just reach out to HR. Like I would reach out to my leadership and I would reach out to HR and just say, hey, like I'm a resource. I've done this for years. I'm happy to just tell you what works, what doesn't work, what tools I've used. Like, as you all think about how this changes, like maybe you start a committee inside of your company of everyone who's ever worked anywhere remotely, right? And you can start this like internal working group that can help the company transition, because honestly, you are the wealth of knowledge, right? Like I've watched people try to reinvent the wheel of what it looks like to work remote, where I'm like, please don't do that. Like I figured that out 5 companies ago, right? Like that does not work. And so it's time for ICs who know this to just take leadership positions. The challenge is going to be resistance to change. It's just a huge human thing. People don't know what they don't know, and you're going to have really smart people in their own way for a while. And so I think hopefully what happens is traditional companies look to the leadership of companies who've already been fully distributed for like best practices and tips. And we just see that versus a bunch of people trying to like create models that just don't work. Yeah, so again, to answer that question, to surmise it, I don't know what's the best way. Like, I think every time I've gone into a different company, you're just going to have a challenge anytime you try to change company culture and process. And so I would focus on tools that help people not resist change generally and figure out what's the best way to insert yourself into that process as a thought leader.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I love that answer. And I think that you gave good tips in terms of like talking to HR, like maybe even like building, like it doesn't have to be a committee. It could be like an informal community or a formal community that just gives their thoughts of how remote work actually works. Like, how does it work well? And I think, and this is the reality, and I think a lot of people are now starting to feel the pain of fully synchronous communication as the only way of connecting teams right now. I think people are like, at the beginning it's like, oh, Zoom, we have Zoom, it's fine. And now it's like, people are like, okay, just like, I need to back off the Zoom a little bit because I'm going nuts here. I need time for myself to think. And like, just like, I'm sitting in this like little box called Zoom. And then the rest of the time I'm sitting in the other box called Slack. And so I think people, I mean, to the question of the person asking the question, people are feeling it right now. They're feeling, by the way, there was a great, like an article I read actually in the BBC about like saying that Zoom actually creates a lot of friction to people because of it's kind of synchronous, but it creates a lot of, because of the camera, and because it creates a lot of stress on people as well, right? So it's not not necessarily super easy thing to do.
We haven't even talked about introverted versus extroverted people in remote cultures. Yeah. Right? That's like a whole nother conversation of like culture, right? Yeah. Like, one of the things that I've always tried to do is, it's really interesting to watch whether you call it social distancing or physical distancing, right? Like, I really like the term physical distancing, right? Because we're not really social distancing. We're being removed from other human bodies, which really goes back into what we've done. And so what's funny is the things that I've gotten used to doing over the last couple of years are being common, like getting on a Zoom call with 20 members of my team around the world and having a drink together. Like, that's just how we used to build engineering team camaraderie. Right? Like, to celebrate people. And now it's a thing that everyone's doing. Yeah. I also think the challenge is people are over Zooming, if that makes sense, right? Yeah. Like, things that used to be just conversations and phone calls with people, you're now hopping on a camera with me. It's like, I don't need to see you.
And I think, by the way, you touched very quickly on a medium that is long forgotten, but I love. Maybe it's because I'm old, but it's this thing.
The telephone, man.
Oh, I'm saying, sorry. It's going rogue in my green screen. It is the phone. Phones are good ways of communicating. They're very reliable.
Can we talk about good product stuff? So here's good product, right?
Okay, go ahead.
I think great product managers are always looking back as much as they're looking forward, right? Like, I love a telephone. You know, the other thing that I love? The taxi cab, right? Like, I was coming out of Salesforce Tower in San Francisco some months back.
Yeah.
It was rush hour. Everyone's waiting for Uber. I mean, you see everybody with their apps out, and they're like 10 cabs lined up just sitting there. And I walk up to the cab and I'm like, hey, do you take credit card? He's like, yeah. I'm like, all right, let's go. Right? Like, analog scenario, because literally all I'm trying to do is go from point A to point B, and like, I'm not price sensitive. And so we forget things like the telephone.
Yeah. I know. And I think I think really is important as a tool. It really is. It's very unstressful, by the way, much less stressful than Zoom. So if a person you know and you talk to all the time, then you don't have to feel like you can do that and like do your dishes, or like, you know, you can do all these like autonomous tasks that you have to do now because you're at home. I think that really is a good tool. So anyway, I'm just conscious. So thanks for that. I appreciate it. I hope it helped the person asking the question. There was another question about companies building products that serve remote teams. I often see these product companies not actually working remotely themselves. Is this the case for Craft.io? So this is a question for us. So being very open and honest, we are a remote team open by definition because our development team and our product and go-to-market teams are in different locations, like different countries. So we are very familiar with the work of remote. We do have had up until very recently a small office that we all went to. I'm one of the people who enjoys from time to time being in an office and like meeting people on a face-to-face basis. It's my personal preferences. I've never enforced on anybody to come to an office or be like, you know, it's not an enforceable priority for the company. So we are what you would define as like kind of more of a hybrid. And we have people who travel from afar, and I tell them like, you know, come, you know, probably come once in a while just to show your face and being like, you know, so people know who you are. But like, I don't need to see your face every morning just because we have an office. That doesn't make any sense to me. So to answer that question, I hope it kind of answers. We have like 4 more minutes. I want to talk very briefly about work-life balance, and which is kind of the weirdest thing that is happening right now. You know, we're all sitting at home, like pretending to have nice Zoom backgrounds, just so, you know, that's how my life actually looks like.
Yeah, this is green screen, by the way.
Yeah, is it? No.
No.
Come on, that's like you just have a nice house. Anyway, so tell me a little bit, like for like 2-3 minutes, just a little bit about like work-life balance in this era of remote, and in general in remote, right? Because remote puts a challenge on that, right?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I say to people all the time, like, in order to be successful as a remote employee in general, like I learned it in entrepreneurial work first. Like, you have to have discipline. You have to be self-fueled. Like, you have to have a discipline, because it's different. Like, if you're not going into an office, there's not a boss over your shoulder to see if you're on Facebook or Instagram, right? So like, you got things to get done.
Or Netflix nowadays, you know?
Or Netflix or whatever, right? Like,
yeah.
And so, but what that also means, on the one side where an employee has to have more discipline, as a remote leader, you have to have more trust too. Like, this is a hard world for the micromanager, right? For the person who wants to make assumptions about your productivity based on the things they see outside of the world. For instance, I had a designer that I work with who has a heavy Instagram presence, right? And one of my partners was saying, hey, is she gonna get our stuff done? Because I see her on Instagram all day posting stuff, right? And I said, look, I don't care. Like, I'm very clear with what I'm expecting, what the deliverables are. And so I don't care if she wakes up at 4 o'clock in the morning and does every day 1 a.m. to 8 a.m. And that's where she kicks out my core hours and then spends the rest of the day doing whatever, right? But like, it takes discipline for her to be able to do that. And it takes trust for me as a leader to trust that she's gonna hit her deliverables. And I just kind of work there. the truth is, I think data shows that people who work from home actually work more than people who go into an office, because it's harder to find a start and a stop. So that's that work-life balance you talk about.
Yeah.
Right? When am I not working? Right? Like
Yeah.
my wife says, I'm always working, because the dangerous thing is my office is across from my bedroom. So if I'm in the middle of the night and I have an idea, I get right up and I go in my office and like my keys start hitting and I'm in, like, you can look at my craft behavior. It's weird, right? Like this dude is like, and now I'm writing. And so I couldn't do that if I was going into an actual office building. So the work-life balance, I think it's on an employee to figure out, like, how do you carve that out for yourself? So like I carve out gym time. I actually leave. I do weird things like go on a commute. Like I'll drive in my car and just listen to music and come back home like I commuted. Like you got to break up the monotony, and like I create process that feels like I go to work, even if I'm working distributed. Like I have to create that separation in my brain of like, I'm on, I'm off.
That's very interesting. I would just add, I mean, one great advice, I would add to that one more tip, which is just a little bit about like also the work environment itself, as in like, don't mix up your bed, your laptop, your workstation, etc. It's bad. I mean, it's a bad habit just because of habit of the separation of work and life, but also just for orthopedic reasoning. Like like I know it sounds like, you know, it's not, but like if you're working from home and you're gonna have back pain very quickly if you don't have like a station that is actually reasonable in your height, and like you have a keyboard and everything is working fine. I can't tell you how many people right now are suffering from a lot of this, like, you know, like neck pain. I know it sounds mundane, but eventually, look, if you're suffering from pain, you're not going to be an effective product manager or developer or anything else, right? So it really just.
I actually like that rule. I like that rule because it's also one of the things I do. Like my wife will say sometimes, like, "Oh, you're working on that thing. Just bring your computer into the living room or into the bedroom and watch this thing with me in the background." I actually separation, right? Like. My work gets done in the office, and if I come into the bedroom or the living room, like I'm not working, right? Like I have to create that separation in my mind.
All right, I have like one more question, and I'm gonna. So this is fascinating. We continue this for forever, but we have one more question from the audience, and then we can kind of wrap it up. So
cool.
We have 40 product managers in my org, like 800 people plus. Prior to stay-at-home orders and working from home, we didn't have the best communication with the department from leadership. During the work from home, there have been multiple process changes related to PDLC, use of Jira, use of AHA, etc. We don't disagree that these changes are necessary as we grow, but the way the changes are communicated was extremely inconsistent and chaotic. Can you speak to communication around change management and process change to distributed teams? What has worked well in your experience?
Man, change management is a discipline like all to itself. And I think that, you know, for me, the places where change management has gone really well is when you've had like project managers specifically focused on those changes, who work really closely with leadership on like what that change is, how to communicate it, the impact of it. Like if you don't have someone dedicated to that role that's really thinking about like a long-term strategy of how you move and grow an organization, then it's going to be chaotic, right? Like you should just expect the chaos. People are living and trying to survive in ambiguity right now. Your product leaders are trying to shift to a very fast changing world. And you should think right now, you are shipping process. You have paused on product, whatever you have been doing to iterate on your features. You should think about your company right now is the product. You are moving in a very agile manner. You are going to break some things. You should break them very fast, and you should fix them very fast. You should not be beholden to anything. You should not, like, you should throw the baby out with the bathwater, like, pardon the old analogy, but like,
of course.
You should embrace this time of chaos. I think this is where good product managers actually excel. Like, things are not going to always be rosy. And so you should, like, fall back on good framework, fall back on good strategy, like, fall back on good process, and just figure out what works for the team and, like, quickly iterate on it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's super, super important. I think it's something that, again, people can cultivate to like bubble up to the leadership as well, because I think that's something that, I mean, people would appreciate right now. It really is very, very, very important. I would, like, again, if I can add just one more thing, this is the time to do conscious communication. Conscious as in, like, I'm thinking about communication as a major thing in my company right now. And it's not, it has to be conscious. And I think people, that's something you can bubble up very easily to anybody, like your manager or your manager's manager, and everybody is going to be receptive because everybody's feeling that as well by themselves. Like there has to be a conscious like thought process. Like, I mean, speaking of change management, it starts with like saying, okay, we're not going to just like, you know, do this and then everybody's just going to align to whatever, a Slack communication or a working from home or, and the other thing I would always remind people, this is probably going to be a while. This is not going, and I'm saying that with like sadness. And of course, there's a lot of other drama that is unrelated to this, like economic drama and of course, health drama. But the reality is that we're all going to be like in a remote, semi-remote. This is going to be like a very rocky road. I suspect remote is going to become a thing that every company will have a person responsible for, a people responsible for, right? So like, how do we do remote? Like, what's our remote policy? Will become a question. It's not like a nice to have question anymore. That's like a must have part of business, basic business continuity of every company in the world. And I think
every company is now a remote company. They just have to determine how remote are they.
Yeah, exactly. And I think now in that sense, I think this is a good, I mean, product is leadership almost by definition. Bubble it up. Say like, look, we need to be ahead of this. We can't be just like, hey, we have these tools, go use it. We need to be like, let's think of the communication schema and let's think of how do we work remotely and how does we sustain that as a team together. So anyway.
And I think that leadership should be coming from the product organization because again, as I mentioned, we're typically the role that is always looking throughout the entire organization and trying to be the glue anyway between leadership, design, engineering, finance, legal. Like you're touching all of these things. So we typically have the understanding of the communication style of each one of those boxes and what they need as far as inputs and outputs. So I think it's really our job to understand like, what's the new version of our human API look like in this new world? Right? We used to connect these things this way. Like now there's we got to rev this API. And what does that look like for us as human product managers who now have to figure out what's the new API? And just, we got to go do the work.
I couldn't agree more. And indeed, PMs are this human API, as you call it, for the organization. So I think there's a huge role for PMs to play as part of just transforming companies to become remote. There's a bunch of more questions, but I'm going to stop here, just kind of conscious of time, your time, my time, and everybody else's time. I really wanted to thank you. And guys in the chat, if you feel like thanks, then people go ahead and thank on the chat. I really want to thank you. It's been very, very insightful. I hope everybody learned something from it, and feel free to like send us some of your comments and your thoughts. There's another question on the Q&A, which I'll answer afterwards over email. Please stay safe, stay healthy. Hopefully some of the stuff, like we can still meet each other as humans soon.
For sure.
And
you got to plan where's the craft, like, you know, conference, bro, the craft product.
the remote conference. Exactly. All right. Thanks everybody, and stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.